Well, hey there, guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, it's part 21 of our Toys and Joys dump truck and pup trailer build. Well, I'm hoping that today's show is going to be the finale of this build. We're going to pick up where we left off. Last week, we had a bit of issues with some parts missing and a few measurements that were a little bit off as far as drill bit sizes. But I'm hoping to pick up where we left off and get the dump box built. Now, guys, it's the same procedure as what we did in the dump truck build. So I'm not going to show that much of the actual procedure of making the parts because I've already shown you that. But we're going to go through the model today. We're going to get that dump box build and mount it. We're going to go through the plans and pick up the small little pieces that we may have missed along the way and hopefully get this model completed and finished up and get this series behind us. It's been a long road. So without further ado, guys, enough of the talking. Let's head over to the bench. Well, I have the majority of our parts cut. And for symmetry, if you're building these to go together, if you're building the trailer to go together with your dump truck, you may want to choose the same species as you did for the truck for the dump bed. Now, guys, if we look at the plans, I'm going to start off with the gate, the rear gate. And really on the plans, looking at sheet 5, there's really no guidance as to where things go. However, if you look at sheet 8, which is our general views page, you can scale directly off of this drawing right here and get your distance between each one of your upright slats. And in this case, it'll be 1 3/8 on the left side and the right side. And then there is a 1 1/4 inch gap in the middle. So because I need the gate dried up first, because I need to do my do not push engraving on the back, we're going to glue this up first. Remember, guys, spacer blocks are your friends. Using a straight edge like I have over here to line up your edge pieces really helps. Just as a refresher, straight edges, squares, setup blocks, anything that you can use to make repeatability available to you. Okay, so I have the dump bed in various stages of glue up. I have the upper and lower rails on the sides glued up. I still want to wait for them to dry a little more. I have the tailgate almost finished, but there's something I want to caution you with. The steps that I took here is I glued the top rail in, I let that dry, and then I glued the 2 side rails in. That way I had a positive reference point on each edge of my square board to be able to get those glued in. And then from there, as you can see with setup blocks, I spaced out the 1 3/8 and glued in these upright slats. However, after I got them all glued in, I then went to glue the bottom rail on, and there was a gap on the 3rd slat from the bottom to the bottom rail. It was only about a 1/16, but it's enough to show. And it turns out that this slat right here is actually slightly shorter than the other ones. Now, guys, this can happen. It can be a little bit of sawdust at your positive stops on your miter fence, on your table saw. Anything as small as that can change your dimensions. So as it turns out, I had cut a couple extras, which I usually do with small parts like this. So I was fine. I could chip this out, clean up the glue joint, and glue the new one in. But that's something to really keep in mind is, in this case, it's kind of hard to do a dry fit, but when you're cutting pieces on the table saw or you're cutting pieces using your small parts cutting jig, however you're doing it, make sure that if you're using positive stops, that there's no debris between your piece of stock and your positive stop that will change the measurement for what you're cutting. Well, while we're waiting for all of this stuff to dry up, we're going to turn our attention to the gate hinges. Now, guys, if we look right here at the bottom, there is a little 45-degree chamfer on each one of these. This was not here on the dump truck gate hinges, and that's no big deal. We'll just put it on. They put it on the plan, so we'll add it. So what I've done is I've taken the pattern, I've used spray adhesive to attach it to some 1/8 thick maple. And guys, we're just going to cut the straight cut first, which is the cut that denotes the end of our piece. Once we get that cut, we're going to tilt our miter fence at 45 degrees and cut one of the chamfers. Now guys, you have to remember you need a left and a right. So in order to cut the opposite side, we need to reverse our miter fence and actually cut it on the right side of the blade, and that's fine. It's a little awkward for me, so I'm using clamps to hold the piece in place. That's no problem. If it's awkward for you and you don't feel comfortable doing it, then use clamps. Let the clamps take the brunt of the blade if that should happen. And once you get that done, you'll end up with something like this, where we have our pieces cut at the end and we have our 90 degrees and our little chamfers on each one. So what we're going to do is we're going to drill this hole here. This is an 11/64 hole. And then I'm simply going to cut this out at the scroll saw, give them a sanding, and then we can attach them to our gate. Well, I have the tailgate now finished with our 2 brackets. We'll just put that aside, waiting for the assembly. And I also have our sides all dried up and sanded. But there's a bit of a problem, and it's most likely my own fault due to bad measuring or whatever. But this piece here, the dump truck front, sits right here in this groove, and that groove should be 1/8 of an inch so that the front of our piece sits flush. However, it's a little bit proud, which tells me that something along here was either cut too big or too small. I'm going to say that this piece here was probably cut a little bit too big, and it doesn't really matter what happened. What matters is that we fix it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the table saw. I'm going to set my blade height to be just below, just shy of the top of this 1/8 inch side. And I'm just going to take a skim off of this sideboard. And once I get that skim taken off, I'm going to clean it up with a chisel, and that should give me the clearance that I need here in order to glue the whole thing together. Well, it looks like I set up the saw well enough that I don't even have to use a chisel. It took it out nice and clean, and we're nicely lined up there. Okay, so no harm, no foul. This is what dry fitting is all about, guys. So we're going to get this glued together now and then let it sit and completely dry up. Well, I've got a couple of axle pins drying up, 5/32 of an inch, and that will be for our gate. While those are drying, we're going to actually glue our dump box to our dump box frame. So I'm going to remove this dump box frame from here, and it essentially gets mounted flush with the front of our dump box right up here and centered on our tire assembly. So we're going to get this glued up, and while this is drying, we're actually going to turn our attention to a couple other of the smaller pieces for the dump bucket, and that would be these bottom side brackets and the bottom front brackets. Guys, these are very simple pieces to make. We're going to do them at the table saw, cutting the 45s from a much longer piece to keep our fingers away from the blade, and then we'll just cut them to length at our miter box. After that, we can glue them in place and then just sand them flush to our entire dump box. Now, you may have noticed a little bit of an odd way for me to cut that, where I actually cut the 45 and then I kind of cross-cut it using my gripper to cut the small piece and then cut the length along the grain. The reason for that is to keep the grain consistent so that the grain runs along this piece here and my corner section right here. Now the grains align. It doesn't look odd that the grain suddenly goes 90 degrees to the project. It's up to you if you want to do it that way. It works well and looks better in the end. Well, while we're waiting for the bottom front and the bottom side brackets to dry up, we're going to turn our attention to the top board middle gussets and the top board end gussets. Guys, once again, these are just a miter box cut. There's no sense in making these at the table saw, although we do have a longer piece. When you're doing the middle gusset and you need to do a 45 back to back, that leaves you with a very small piece to hold on to. So much better to do it here at the miter box. These are not imperative pieces. They're just decorative. So even if they're a little bit off, they're fine. You're not going to notice that. So I'm going to get all of these cut and then we can glue them in place. So in case you were wondering, I have in this pup trailer as well, I've reduced the size of the roller because I want to add another net using that window screen material. So I've just done the same thing. I've drilled in some 1/8 dowels into the end of a 1/4-inch dowel. I've sanded this down a bit to give us a little more play for when the net goes in. But now what I can do is we can get this piece here, which is our cylinder housing. We're going to glue this in place in our trailer, or in our dump bed rather, just like this, right where it belongs. We're going to glue that in place and let that set up. And from there, we can do the assembly. We can put it all together here on our trailer frame, as well as put our pins in place. I'm going to finish up these axle pins for the gate. We're going to get that installed, and I'll show you where you're at that point in time once I get all of that done. Well, no one can say that I don't learn from my mistakes. And if you remember, when we glued in the net block pivots on the dump truck, I kind of struggled a little bit because everything was glued together and it was kind of a real pain. So we had some issues with that. This time, however, I'm not putting my dump box in place. I'm going to glue these in ahead of time. And that way we're not going to have the same struggle issues that we had before. Once we get these in place, we're going to glue together the frame for our netting, and we'll get that assembled and see how that all goes. So one of the last major pieces to make is this dump box lip. Now, guys, I've deviated from the plan a little bit here. I didn't like the 1/16 inch thick top. I made it 1/8. It's a little beefier. It gives me something to clamp onto to get it placed up here. As well, I kind of deviated from my methods. And with this one, what I did was I built a square box all the way around, sanded the edges flush, and then I attached this to a larger square block. And then over at the belt sander, after marking it out, I sanded our taper here on the sides. And I think we got a lot cleaner looking top lip with that front edge here, this front section angled perfectly with our taper as well as the back angled. So I'm going to finish giving this a sanding, and then we're going to glue this in place right here in the front. Well, one of the last pieces on here, guys, to make is this tailgate gusset. And again, I'm not a big fan of it. I don't like what they've done here. It's way too thin as far as I'm concerned, and that thinness doesn't allow for any kind of glue surface area. So although it calls for 1/8 material, I have beefed it up to 1/4. I also don't like the fact that they have it perfectly in line here with these angled pieces of the dump bucket at the rear. It looks odd to me that that piece is angled, but yet this dump bed flat section here is not angled. So it looks really off. If you look on the drawing, you can see here that it just doesn't look right. So what I've done is I have actually laid it flat at a 90-degree angle here to our dump bed base. And I think it looks a lot better. We do have the overhang here of the corner, but it all fits. It all goes together and it still looks great. So I'm not concerned about it. And actually, I think that this looks better in my mind than if it came up on an angle and then suddenly there was this weird straight flat piece. So that's what I've done with that. Now, guys, there are a few other pieces here that are on these prints, smaller pieces, and most of them are lights. And I have to say that I really don't like them. And if I don't like them, then they're not going on the model. There's also this tailgate lock that's here on the prints. And I really find it to be kind of a useless piece. Again, I don't like it, and I'm not going to put it on the model. So with that and everything done here the way that we have it, I think that we can call this one finished. So we'll just put it on to the dump truck and I'll show you the whole project all together. And there you go. After 21 episodes, this is what we've got. Pretty cool. I've been waiting 21 weeks to say this, actually longer. And there you have it. Toys and Joy's dump truck and pup trailer build completed. Guys, what an extensive build series. What an extensive trip. What a long journey, but well worth the time it took to do it. Total, all in all, 245 hours it took for me to build this project. 182 on the dump truck and 63 on the trailer. Now, let's be fair about that. 63 on the trailer, why so much less than on the dump truck? Because I made all of the wheels during the dump truck build. So I had those already done, and that is so time consuming, the wheels and the rims. I think it took 3 or 4 actual days of woodworking in the shop, not what you guys see here on the show, but I think it took 3 or 4 days alone just to make all of those wheels and rims. As well, I also had some time consuming pieces like the mud flaps. They were done and already engraved, ready to go. I did those with the dump truck. And as well, as you build things, you get better as you go. You get faster as you go. And unintentionally, you don't try to go faster, you just end up doing it. So because a lot of the pieces on the trailer were actually repeats of the dump truck, things like the dump bed frame, all of that stuff, the mud flap bracket, the pivots, the pistons, or the cylinders as they call them, all of this stuff was all just a repeat performance. So unintentionally, even though you don't try to speed up, you actually do speed up because you've done it once. There's no need to check this or check that and make sure that you're doing it right because you've already done it. You know what you're doing. So all you really need to do is check your measurements as well. Your glue ups get faster because you already overcame the problems of the first time and you know what to look for. Things like gluing up that tarp rack, the debris screen. We know, or I know, that in the first one, I struggled with getting that in there properly and having it well aligned because I had already assembled it. So this time it went a lot faster. Why? Because I learned from my first mistake, didn't glue the dump bucket in, and was able to flip it over and work on it freely with no obstructions. Now, guys, Toys and Joy's patterns are not without their issues. They're not without their problems. They do have things like missing measurements, missing hole sizes, missing dimensions. In this case here with the trailer, completely missing parts. And of course, a lot of it is up to interpretation. So we had that one piece in the first build, or the 2 pieces in the dump truck, that I never found the place for them. But then, as you guys know, others sent me in their interpretation, and their interpretation was far left and mine was far right. And mine was far from right and theirs was right. If that makes any sense. But what I'm saying is, just because there's problems with the plans, with missing measurements or what have you, it doesn't mean there's there isn't a workaround. It doesn't mean that you can't figure it out. You can scale from 1-to-1 sections of the drawings because these plans are in a 1-to-1 scale unless otherwise noted. So it's very easy just to put a tape measure down on there and get the dimensions that you need. Guys, it's very difficult to make a set of plans and make them perfect. I know because I've designed toys and I've made very simple plans and I still mess them up. So I can't imagine what it would take to be able to make these plans and have them perfect. And as I've said here on the show, I have an older version of this set of plans. So by now, they may have been corrected. But what these challenges do, and I call them challenges, not mistakes, because they challenge you as a woodworker and they challenge your skill set to be able to step up to the plate and overcome that. We had the missing pieces there in the cylinder cover box. And did I just fold in my cards and say I'm out? No, I designed my own little piece. That's what makes us woodworkers. That's what makes us capable, and that's what makes these projects fun. For me, it's not about cutting up the pieces of wood and gluing them together. Anybody can do that. It's about the problem solving. It's about the manipulating of the pattern to make it work the way that you want. I saw an issue where the dump bed didn't tilt the way I wanted. So I sanded a little radius on the dump box frame. It's all about overcoming the challenges, challenging yourself, learning as you go, learning from your mistakes, because there were plenty made on this build. And the final product that you get at the end with the dump truck and the pup trailer, looking as nice as what it does. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I love the way this looks. That is just the icing on the cake. It's not so much about the destination, it's about the journey. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in this week. I want to thank you for tuning into the entire series. This has been a really long haul, pun intended. You know, I didn't expect this to go 21 parts. That was never, ever in my imagination. But I have to say they're 21 parts well spent. And if you take the time to go through the parts and watch, there is a ton of information in there and a ton of methods to learn if you're not sure about how to make a piece. Either way, guys, I hope you've enjoyed the series. We're going to move on with the show now. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We have an amazing audience base, and I'm hoping that you're going to consider becoming a part of that. I want to thank you all again for tuning in and being so supportive all the steps along the way. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that you're going to get yourself a set of these plans, follow along, and make your own dump truck and pup trailer. It really is a fantastic project. And more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.